Beautiful day in the neighborhood. What's this guy doing on the side? He's just chilling. He's just chilling. Hi there. It's a beautiful day today, so I'd like to go for a ride and talk about where the rubber meets the road. So let's talk about what friction is. Friction is basically what happens when two surfaces slide past one another, or in fact, not even necessarily slide, but it's that sort of grip force that occurs. So we have two different types of friction. We have static friction, which is when you have two surfaces that are trying to slide past one another, but they aren't actually sliding. And then when they actually do break free of one another, they are in fact sliding. So they're sliding past, and they're different types of friction. One is static, okay, where it's not sliding, and then there's kinetic, where it is sliding. And the difference is that, you know, surfaces have bumps and grooves and that sort of thing. And so with static friction, it's kind of when those like bumps and grooves kind of get all hung up, you know, like, it's kind of when they get all hung up on each other and they don't want to break free. So with static friction, it's when they're hung up, and then if you are able to pull enough force, you can actually break it free and allow those things to start to slide. And once something starts to slide, it wants to kind of keep sliding. So it's much harder to break it free of that static friction than it is to keep it moving with kinetic friction. And then, let's kind of actually like look at and define the friction force. And so a force is a push or a pull in its most basic form. So if a friction force is equal to the coefficient times the normal force. The normal force being the force that is perpendicular to the surface. So if this is our surface, then perpendicular to that, in fact actually up, would be the normal force. Now if it's an angle, then the normal force would be at that angle. I see brake lights. Why do I see brake lights up there? So if I take this turn up here, which is a fun turn, I'm going to be reliant on the friction force, which is going to be parallel to the surface. I'm going to be reliant on the friction force to keep me grounded. So that friction force running parallel to the ground, what determines how strong that friction force is? So that's the coefficient of friction times the normal force. So the normal force is going to be at its maximum essentially when you are on a flat level surface. Well, that's actually not entirely true, and I'll get into that a little bit. But if you're on a flat level surface and you have the friction force or the normal force straight up, then mg is acting down, the normal force is acting up, and so you multiply that by the coefficient of friction. So like I said, static friction has a higher value of that coefficient, kinetic friction is a lower value. So what is the type of friction between my wheels and the road? Where the rubber meets the road, that type of friction is static, because you have a different point of contact between each part of the wheel on the road at each moment in time. So as the wheel rotates, there's a different point of contact, and there's no sliding occurring there. Okay, sliding is the main point, not moving. Okay, it's sliding. So what changes the coefficient? What changes the coefficient is to whether it's kinetic or static, and what the materials are that are trying to grip against one another. So rubber and concrete, for example, will have one coefficient, especially on like dry roads. Wet roads is different. The coefficient between rubber and concrete on dry roads is usually around 1, and then if it's wet roads, it's usually about 0.8, 0.7, something like that. And then what changes the normal force? So obviously if I weigh more, then I'm going to have a larger normal force, because the force of gravity acting down is then going to have something acting back up. That's going to be the normal force. And so if I'm pushing down harder, the ground obviously must push up harder in order to keep me from, just like sinking down into the ground. Well, what if I were to slam on my brakes? You know that 70% of the braking force on a car or a motorcycle or even a bicycle, 70% of the braking force is actually in the front wheels. And so why is that? So I don't know if you're able to tell, but when I hit the brakes, the vehicle shifts forward. My center of mass between the bike and myself, our center of mass together will shift forward because the front suspension compresses, all of the weight or the mass shifts forward. So the center of mass shifts towards the front wheel, and there's extra force being put down into the ground onto that front wheel, which means that the ground must push back in order to keep me from sinking into the ground. The ground pushes back and the normal force is increased, which means, well, the normal force times the coefficient is the friction force, so that means that the friction force also increases. This is a hot mess. Holy cow, Soleils, I love it, but not today. People, it's a pandemic. What the heck? Holy crap. So as I was saying, so the friction force increases to compensate, and really it shouldn't how do I get out of here? So it shouldn't really matter it shouldn't really matter like what you know, what my surface area is of my tires. It shouldn't matter any of that stuff. The friction force, like the friction force should be compensated to a point where I should be able to stop in the same distance. Is that reality? No, it's not. So the suspension is a huge deal. Obviously the rubber of the tires matters, right? But let's just kind of forego that for a moment. The suspension itself, a better quality suspension is going to be able to keep the tire attached to the road better. Why is it that wide tires are better? Perhaps you can think of it in a couple ways. For one, more surface area allows for more contact, meaning that at least some part of the tire will be in contact with the road at all times, so you're more likely to have more contact, at least some contact. Also, the other thing is this, is that in reality, you will surpass the capability of the rubber at some point. So if I were to like really press down onto that tire, will it just continue to increase the friction force proportionally? Just as, you know, if I press down into the ground twice as much, will the friction force be twice as much? If it's 10 times more, will the friction force be 10 times more? And the answer is not necessarily, because at some point the rubber compound, each individual molecule can only handle so much force acting on it before it increases its temperature due to that friction, and then rubber is elastic to a certain point. It can stretch, right? And so rubber can stretch up to maybe about 10 times of its original size before you lose that elasticity. It goes from an elastic phase to a plastic phase. Plastic meaning that it will not rebound and return back to its original shape and size. And so if the rubber is being stretched and pulled and heated in such a way to where you're changing its fundamental properties, then it's going to lose traction at the road, and all of a sudden you're going to be in kinetic friction, which you do not want. You absolutely do not want kinetic friction. So what happens with kinetic friction? Well, that's when you slide and you go off the road, basically. So especially think of it, you're in a car. So you're going around a turn, and you're going a little too fast and you break free of that static friction, it turns into kinetic friction. So a couple things happen. For one, now you are breaking down into a friction force that is less. So you're not going to be able to actually go either speed up, slow down, turn. You're not going to be able to stick to the road as well now, because you've gone from coefficient of 1 to probably 0.7 or so. That would be the kinetic friction of rubber. And then the other issue too is that because you're not, you know, having a different point of contact with each moment with a wheel, you've lost the whole purpose of having a wheel. So now you're just sliding straight, and you've lost all control going left and right. So as you're going around a turn and you start to slide for one reason or another, if it's in the winter and you hit ice, whatever it might be, all of a sudden you're going straight. And if you see a guardrail straight in front of you, that's it. You're going straight for that guardrail. So that is what's going to happen if you lose traction. Now, what about Formula One race cars? If I have, okay, so I said that rubber has a coefficient of about 1. So that means that in ideal conditions, if my force is mg acting straight down, the normal force acting up is mg, and so then if the coefficient is 1, the normal force times 1 would equal to a value equal to the normal force. So that means that the friction force that is lateral, okay, side to side, would be equal to the normal force. So that means that I can pull 1g in this direction at its maximum before I go sliding around that curve. But Formula One race cars can pull 6Gs. How is that possible? Do they have a coefficient of friction that's equal to 6? That'd be crazy. And the answer is no. Oh, I love Bathroad. Let's take Bathroad. Instead, what happens if they have these wings and aerodynamics that because as they're going fast, the aerodynamics pushes down on the car and it actually pushes the car down into the road. And so as that car gets pushed down into the road because of the aerodynamic force, the air pushing it down, the ground then in turn pushes it back up. And so you can have so much downforce that it allows for the car to actually be able to pull a lateral 6Gs. So these cars can actually accelerate laterally at higher speeds more than they can at slow speeds. So what's crazy about that is they can actually take a turn more safely at a fast speed than they can at a slow speed. Please understand that is not how your car works, though. Not at all, because you do not have those sort of aerodynamic forces happening in your car, because they are concerned about gas mileage and looks on your car as opposed to having ideal downforce conditions. If you're applying ideal downforce for traction, you are also not having good aerodynamics for gas mileage. Okay, so keep that in mind. There is a trade-off there. And then what is the other issue about, I said that this is not really, having a flat surface is not necessarily ideal. It kind of is, but it's kind of not. So if I'm taking a turn to the right here, I would want the road to be banked in this direction. And that's because as I'm trying to make a turn, okay, in fact, this is a great turn onto the left and then right. So the first turn, if it's banked this way, I would want it to be banked this way, so that way as I'm turning, the road is pushing me that way, and I'm able to push into the road as it forces me along. The worst is having a road that banks in the opposite direction, which I'm trying to think. I know there's a road around that does that. I don't think I'm going to have time to get to it though today. So if you have a road that's banked in the opposite way, so let's say that this road is banked like this, I would be like floating away from the road, and that would be terrible. And there is a road in the valley here that does that, and there's crashes every year because of it, because people take this turn on a hilly road, and then all of a sudden, that's it. They lose all traction because the normal force is decreased so much. So ideally, you want a road to be banked, okay, but banked in the right direction, and we can actually calculate the forces acting on that. And that's something we'll cover when we talk about circular motion, because we are trying to accelerate towards the center of the circle as you're going around a turn. Oh, this house is for sale. Really? I am house shopping, people. I am house shopping. Interesting. I don't think that this is going to work for me, though, unfortunately. All right, so let me talk about another thing. Difference between like motorcycles and cars. So with cars, you would want to brake into the turn, and then once you get to the apex, or sort of the middle of the turn, that's when you would want to shift from gas to brake. Because as you're going into the turn, you're shifting weight towards the front tires. Oh yes, cross the road, people. You're shifting weight towards the front tires, where there's going to be a larger normal force, and then you're going to have more traction. And so because you're slowing down, right, you want to have that traction and force down into those tires. There's of course 2 tires in the front, 2 tires in the back, and that's kind of an important issue. Then when you want to accelerate out of the turn, you hit the gas, it's going to shift weight towards the back tires, and that's why rear-wheeled cars are typically like better for racing, because as you come out of a turn, you want to shift that weight towards the rear. As you accelerate, it's going to shift the weight towards the back, and you're going to have a greater normal force on the back, and you're going to have better traction. So front-wheel drive cars are not the best for going around turns. All-wheel drive are good, but they typically will weigh more because of the extra parts involved, and so since most of the traction is going to be in the rear wheels anyway, most cars that are at their top level are going to be rear-wheel drive. It kind of depends on the road conditions, that kind of thing, but rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. And then for motorcycles, that's a little bit different. So you want to enter a turn at a slower speed and then accelerate through the turn. And the reason for that, the reason why you don't want to be braking through the turn on a motorcycle is because if you do lose traction with the front tire, like that's it. It's gonna slide out from under you. The wheel's just gonna slide out and you are down to the ground. And I've unfortunately had it happen to me, and it's not fun. Yes, you should get farther away. Save the car, kill the motorcyclist. That's good. All right, so that's gonna probably do it for most of my little bit of chat. I'm gonna kind of maybe throw it back to myself in my office to try to finish things up and, illustrate anything that needs to be left. So, see you guys in a minute. Right now. Hey, long time no see. Just so you know, this has been my first major editing project, so you'll have to excuse any of my mistakes or gratuitous editing systems and that kind of thing as I learn how to use the technology. But I would like to go over a couple of things to kind of finish things off nonetheless. So let's take a look at what I've got here. So a couple things. For one, remember that this is our equation for the friction force. We have the coefficient of static or kinetic friction times the normal force. And so the main thing I want you to get out of this video is that the greater the normal force, the greater the force of friction. Now we can increase the normal force in one of two ways. We can either increase the weight of the object, so we're going to increase mg. So we have the center of mass of this thing, mg acting down, and then of course there must be a force acting up, and that would be the normal force. But we can increase the normal force without increasing mg, and the way to do that would be to add an additional force acting down. Now that force might be literally you pushing down onto the handlebars, and so in that moment you will have a response from the normal force. There must be. Or it could be aerodynamic forces acting down from like the Formula One race car that we had talked about. And so there's a number of ways that you can create this additional force down, and you will have a greater normal force acting back up. And so long as you have that greater additional normal force acting up, then you will have a greater friction force. So what does that mean? So for this motorcycle that is trying to turn off to the right, so it's trying to accelerate in that direction, so that's the direction of acceleration, then that means that there's a friction force that is acting in this direction. So if we have a greater normal force, that means that this friction force can be greater, okay? Clearly it looks like this motorcycle would tip over, but just think of it this way. It's like the wheel is trying to accelerate underneath the rest of the bike, and it keeps it from falling over. And we can kind of think of it that way. Also, there is another way to think of it as well. In fact, let me get rid of a few of my arrows here. So if we have another way to look at it, what if the ground was instead moving? We have basically this happening where the ground is trying to move in this direction, okay, relative to the motorcycle. So what would happen to the motorcycle tire is a nice thing to realize, is that you would have this deformation that occurs in that direction. That's the direction in which the tire will deform, and it can only deform so much. So that kind of goes to that extra point that I was talking about trying to brake and turn at the same time.
that can be problematic. Yes, you are increasing the normal force on that front wheel because weight is shifting forward. However, that can be problematic because you're just asking too much of that front tire, and there's going to be too much deformation, and you will get to what's known as a glass effect. It'll go to the plastic phase. So there's actually a couple of different things that will happen there. And so there's one other thing that I'd like to discuss as well, and that is ABS brakes. And so ABS brakes is an anti-lock braking system. And so if we have this wheel that is going to the right, and of course it would also be rotating as it's going to the right. Of course I can't make both happen at the same time in my little drawing, but you get the idea. And so if you were moving along and then all of a sudden you locked up the wheel, and if you don't have ABS brakes and you lock up the wheel, then all of a sudden you are no longer having a different contact point with the ground at each moment in time. So look, if this thing was moving along, we would have this point right here, and then it looks like it's going to touch the ground there at that next sort of like line that I have drawn, right? So it's going to move a little bit, okay, and it's going to have another contact point about there. Well, if you don't have ABS, then it's just simply going to slide. The whole point of there being different contact points is that this spot is going to grip with that part of the road. This spot is going to grip with that part of the road. It is static friction. But if the wheel locks up and suddenly is no longer rotating, then it's just going to slide. And this part of the tire right there is just essentially like a box. It might as well just be a box just sliding along the ground. And instead of it being static friction, it is now kinetic friction, which has a lower value. With rubber on concrete, it's probably about 20% lower. So if you're in a car, not only do you not have a different point of contact with each moment and you have lost the ability to turn, but now in addition to that, you are actually slowing down at a slower rate, and it is frankly just trouble. So please be aware of that and watch out for that. So one way to prevent that from happening can be to increase the normal force, or another way is to simply slow down so you don't have so much friction force necessary to slow down or speed up. Always keep in mind it is in fact the force of friction that is causing an object to speed up or slow down or turn, and so that's what we have going on. So with that, I think that we are going to kind of end things, and I hope that this was helpful and not too much for not too distracting with my video. So hope to see you guys next time. You have a good one.